Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and this is one of the many webinars we do. And this one looks at something that we all get worried about nowadays, and that is when we see public policy made, when we see discussion on social networks, we wonder what is the truth and what is not the truth. And we wonder whether people are expressing an opinion or making policy on the basis of a whim or caprice or self-interest, or whether they're doing it based on evidence. And we've got Tracey Brown with us today, who since, I think for about 19 years has been director of Sense About Science. And she's very concerned about evidence-based policy making. And we'll go through that today and ask her a bit about Sense About Science. So Tracey, thanks for joining us today. And perhaps you could start telling us a bit about Sense About Science and what its mission is.
Sure. Really great to join you, and my favourite subject as well. I think perhaps the first thing to make very clear is that Sense About Science promotes the public interest in sound science and evidence. So what we are not is an advocacy group for the idea that everybody should understand or love science. You know, there is a big section of society that does want to go to the Science Museum on a Saturday morning and watch the whiz bang wow of putting Mentos in a Coke bottle and all that. And that's fantastic. And they want to become, astronomers or whatever. And that's brilliant. But that's not what we're about. We no more argue that people should understand the laws of motion or be able to disaggregate statistics in a graph than that they should know the rule of law or how to read Shakespeare or anything like that. So that's kind of not what we're about. And we're not an advocacy organisation for funding of science either. What we're interested in is evidence as the kind of currency of public life, and a way of finding ways of finding out how the world is, and also describing how we'd like it to be when it comes to things like, actually explaining what it is, for example, in agriculture, or what it is in terms of population statistics that we would expect to see, given that, we're told that sort of moves to improve things and different policies to improve things. So we're interested in the kind of currency of public life.
So what is it that has given you this passion? I mean, you're not a scientist, are you? I think you studied sociology of law. So you're not a scientist. And Dick Taverner, who I think started Sense About Science, as far as I know, he wasn't a scientist either. But I remember when I was a teenager, him winning a by-election in Lincoln. I remember that distinctly. I stayed up all night to watch it. So, I mean, what's your sort of passion that's led you to where you are now?
Well, I think one of the things that's made me very much like I am now is my own progress personally. It was through education. So I understand the value of knowledge. I was one of those kids who teachers took an interest in at school, and there are a handful of teachers that were responsible for sort of moving me out of my beginnings into being able to have opportunities. I went to university. I wasn't the first person in my family to go to university. I was the first person in my family to be in school after 15. So to get that far was something that came from education, but perhaps much more socially than that. I early in the 90s, I worked in Russia, and I worked on a big project to set up social research centers there. And it really struck me, being in a society where, you didn't have a clear picture of how the world was working. People didn't know. If you take something like social statistics, that influenced me at the time, and it interested me very much at the time, people didn't know what the data was about, whether men and women were in an equal position, whether the town, up the road had a similar set of problems. They didn't know whether the evidence about environmental impacts could be trusted. There were so many things that people just didn't have a means to describe what was going on or to hold those in power to account. And that really struck me in the early 90s in Russia. And I think it made it very clear to me that there's a Canadian philosopher called James Robert Brown who influenced me very early on when Dick Taverner was first talking to me. He wrote a great book called Who Rules in Science? And in it, he pretty much said, they've got the guns and the money. All that's left to the rest of us is knowledge. And that's been my big influence.
But knowledge is a very powerful weapon. But what makes you different, for example, from Scientists for Global Responsibility? I mean, they have a huge national and international network of scientists, engineers, citizens, and so on. And they're very concerned about science being used in a responsible way. Are you different from them?
So I think there are, and there have been since the 60s, there have been, particularly sort of from the anti-nuclear background, there have been sort of activists who are concerned about what they see as potential abuses of scientific applications. We're not so interested in technology, although occasionally we get involved if things are misrepresented in the public discussion. We want people to have a clear access to the facts about things, but the discussion about what we should and shouldn't do is a social one, right? It's one for us to negotiate. And if you take something like vaccination, that has to remain somebody's personal decision. We can have, make sure that we have the clear access to the information about the vaccine, that we deal with misinformation or misleading claims that people make. But and equally on the other side, we make sure that if there are things that are less than good, people know about them. But that's an important thing to understand is that we have the evidence, and on that evidence we make our minds up about what our values are.
One of the things you said at the beginning is that you were interested in how the world was and how the world should be. And you correct me if I'm wrong, because I often am. What I've read about you and some of your comrades from the past is they're very interested in what's called the fourth industrial revolution. 3D printing, gene editing, robotics, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and so on. Is that something that influences you in terms of thinking of how the world should be?
No, actually, just point blank, no, not at all. It's not something that Sense About Science gets involved in, other than where we think people need to be appraised of the facts. So, for example, there's a huge growth in the use of modelling in decision making. So whether that's the departments that decide things about who gets what, in deciding who's fraudulent or might be fraudulent when you're assessing a benefit claim or an application for a mortgage, right the way through to designing cities and as people have seen, measuring the impacts of climate change and COVID. Those are very big areas that modelling is being used. And we have politicians, policymakers, commissioners across every government in the world who actually have no idea what it is they're commissioning when they commission those black boxes and those models. And as citizens, how on earth do we make it accountable if the decision was made by the computer effectively or by the software? How on earth do we make that accountable? We are not equipped as a society for decision making to be made like this. We need to be. So that's the kind of thing that Sense About Science gets involved in. We're not interested in the brave new world of technology. I'm sure some of my my colleagues are interested in areas that they've researched in the past, but it's not something that interests Sense About Science particularly.
So when you do what you're just saying, are you interested in finding the evidence, or are you also interested in looking at the consequences of that evidence?
I think the consequences is something that society much more broadly needs to be involved in as a discussion. So I think you see the consequences of people not having clear access to what's going on and understanding it is that they do things, we see public money wasted on things that don't work. And when I talk about evidence, I'm not just talking about stuff that comes out of laboratories and or that's around sort of understanding how tech works or something. I'm talking about things that we understand. For example, that there are certain impacts on young people from not having a social life, and so there's evidence at the moment that governments are considering about the effects of lockdowns on teenagers and mental health. I'm talking about evidence in that sense too, rather than sort of much more the technological kind of thinking about it.
But you're interested in who makes decisions and the evidence on which they make those decisions. You're interested in government, you're interested in local government. Are you also interested in corporations, which in a way are becoming the governments of the 21st century, big pharma, oil industries, agro industrial complexes? Are you concerned about how they use evidence, or how indeed sometimes they even conceal evidence?
Yeah, very much so. So Sense About Science set up All Trials, which was a global campaign that was led by patients and doctors and consumer groups and so on. And but we set up All Trials across the world as a campaign to get all clinical trials published. So when we started All Trials in 2012, it was around half, and that's being charitable, around half of clinical trial results were being published, just half. That was the half, presumably, that people wanted you to see. It wasn't only pharmaceutical companies that were guilty, academia was guilty too, that people would just move on to the next grant, not want to waste the time publishing their results, or didn't think they were sexy enough, or didn't actually like the results, so they concealed them. So people, we had a situation where the medicines that people were being prescribed all over the world were based on half the information. That's dangerous. It was also damaging to new medicines that could be better, but we can't see if they're better because we've overstated the benefits of what people are being given at the moment. So it was a really important thing for us to intervene on. It is a problem that had languished for 30 years with medics knowing about it, writing cross letters to the Lancet or the British Medical Journal or the New England Journal of Medicine, but never really doing anything about it. Because I think that it's a bit of, medicine is a bit of a closed shop in some ways. And so we sort of blew it open. And the result of that has been changes at the European level to the law of reporting, changes by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, a massive culture change, actually, a massive culture change. The pharmaceutical industry eventually saw the writing on the wall and have changed their practices. So we're now in a position in the UK where we're well over 90% of past trials are now published.
But, they may have changed their practice and that's fine, but you must be concerned in a way when you're trying to find evidence about how major interests, and they're often corporations, but they don't have to be corporations, can lobby and finance and often finance many an American politician in their campaigns. Those things must really be huge barriers to getting the truth out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you end up with a level of it's not transparent, is it, what it is that you're dealing with? So you think you're having a discussion about the best place, as a society, as a community, people may think they're having the discussion about the best place to site a waste disposal unit or something, and in fact what they're really doing is having a discussion about who's leaning on whom behind the scenes, and you can't get your arms around that as a community. So that's very frustrating. I think it's powerful, though, to insist still that people answer to the evidence. And unless we carry on insisting that, if we withdraw cynically and just say, well, it's all, everyone's scratching everyone else's back and it's all just envelopes under the table. I mean, we take ourselves out of public life and we take out that element of accountability and scrutiny that needs to be there when the people are there.
I think you wrote once, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we should not question so much who does the funding, but the value of the research, if the efficacy is there. But when the research is challenged by other scientists and the ones with money are there with their power, it's not the evidence that counts, it's the cash, isn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, I think I've never suggested that we shouldn't know who's funded research. I think it's really important that people are transparent about the funding of their research, and that through that way we can actually track things like whether there's a tendency of research that's funded by a particular sector to always find results that favour that sector. I mean, we can actually review that, which is very important. So yeah, absolutely, the strides that we've made in declarations of interest and funding, incredibly important to hold on to. However, what we shouldn't do is imagine that people who are on the side of the angels, or who we perceive to be on the side of the angels, always produce good and reliable research, or that sometimes people that we have a lot to be critical about don't sometimes produce good and reliable research. I mean, to give you an example, I personally think it's a absolute scandal that someone is able to own as much of the world's wealth as Bill Gates does. I think it's absolutely wrong that individuals should be functioning like small countries and very powerful. But having said that, that doesn't mean that I am dismissive of the really amazing work that's funded by his foundation on treating malaria, for example.
your view is that we should be skeptics, which is in the tradition of science. I mean, science is not about proving, is it? It's about disproving all the time, right, and going on. So you would argue that that sort of skepticism is how we should behave in decision-making bodies and as citizens.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think those tools, the tools of critical thinking, are things that serve all of us very well, and enable us to be discerning about, what we do and don't take on board from people. I think the other thing to understand is, that we can accept what people give us by way of evidence without accepting the idea that they tell us how to live. I mean, scientists bring something to the party, but they aren't experts in how we live our lives.
I mean, that's sort of interesting, and wanting to get that out to the general public is important, but we're in a sort of environment now which, we're looking at the madness of the crowds, the post-truth environment. Is this something that concerns you, that even if you get the evidence out there, there's a whole sort of wave of skepticism about that because of that new post-truth environment?
Francis, I think we've got a lot of different things going on here. I mean, for the first part, I would say, let's be a little bit careful about thinking that society is post-truth. I mean, I think the year that went into the Oxford English Dictionary, 2016, was also a year, I mentioned all trials, it was a year when patient groups across the world joined all trials seeking the truth from pharmaceutical industry. It was 96 was the year in which 96 families at the Hillsborough football stadium disaster won a nearly 30-year battle for the truth that had taken them through understanding, tensile strengths of fences, concrete stresses, blood gases and statistics. And people when they are motivated and they feel that something matters to them will very much want to reach for the truth and understand what the truth is. So I think sometimes this post-truth society is used as a stick to kind of beat the public with when, in a disparaging way. I think people are still interested. We do definitely have an element whereby I think people have become quite fed up with the political, elites that we have in society, and sort of a lot of people generally function with a kind of, if it's good for them, then it's clearly not good for the likes of me. And that will go for the evidence too. And that's what I mean about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that we need to be a bit careful.
Well, let me put that in a slightly different way, not in terms of post-truth, but we've seen the rise of populism. We've seen that in this country, we've seen that in America, see that in Eastern Europe. And, there's a sort of view, because lots of people have felt so disenfranchised, that that everybody's views should be treated equally, that one person's truth is as valuable as another person's truth. It's a view that libertarians hold particularly. Now, that is a strong argument for people who feel ignored, but it does act as a sort of barrier, a sort of, something that doesn't allow the scientific evidence to get through because they don't value it as much as they do their own opinion.
Yeah, and it brings us back to the old adage that you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your facts. I think we have to be very careful. Some of this stuff this complaint goes back to kind of days when also people complained about sort of postmodernist ideas, that we all have our own perspective on the world, and that's fine. I think if we give up on the idea that we can deal in the same currency, then we really do give up on the idea of working in any kind of way to improve society. But I think one of the issues that we need to be careful of when people react, just take the climate change debate in America, really frustrating for the scientists involved to try and get across the significance of both climate change, which is impacting America enormously. In California, you've got all the fires, you've got all sorts of drought problems and so on. But also the frustration of, people not acknowledging the contribution that the US is making to climate warming. And that I can see is really, really frustrating. The problem that they have is that that whole debate has got mixed up with the sense of who gets to have a say. And I think a lot of the sort of knee-jerk anti-climate action response comes from just a general frustration that the policy world, the politicians don't deliver for people. And I think perhaps we need to look at solving some of those issues, issues of alienation, really, rather than try and resolve them through a contest about evidence.
I think that's true. We have to deal with the alienation, the poverty, all the things that make people frustrated and angry about the situation they're in. But, don't you get sort of frustrated at times that all of these groups who have strong views quote evidence, but it's partial evidence, and there's not a look at the totality of the evidence, and that helps to add fire to the fury that people have, and you find people then are weaponizing evidence rather than using it.
Absolutely, and that's really difficult to distinguish. I mean, there are lots of debates as well that appear to be discussions about scientific evidence, but in fact they're motivated by something else. I mean, a good example of that is what's happened to, again, in the US more than European countries, but what's happened to the abortion debate. It seemed to become a debate about fetal viability at 20 weeks, rather than actually what it was a debate about whether women have a right to abortion or whether life is sacred. And that's sort of rehearsing that discussion through the prism of scientific evidence is problematic. I think that often doesn't come from the contest first. So you look at people's reaction when they say, well, I reject your science, I'll cherry pick my own, or I'll sort of latch on to a sort of David Icke kind of character on YouTube or whatever. But actually the transference of that discussion into science often happens with appeals to authority from decision makers. So, when politicians say, oh, we're being led by the science, it kind of sets up the scientific debate to be the place where you're going to have a row about what policies work. And that's problematic. I think we see a lot of cowardliness on the part of governments at kind of fronting on issues that they should explain their decisions on, and instead want to sort of step back and say, we'll have a scientific review, we'll let the scientists decide. Not surprisingly, that politicizes the science.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when the government or anyone says we're deciding on the science, you sort of get rather skeptical about that. But I mean, your organization and your campaign, if you can call it a campaign, it's not just about evidence, is it? It's about being open and transparent about the evidence you have. And is that something you think should be the case for all organizations who make decisions? Is openness and transparency absolutely vital?
Yeah, I mean, we have many campaigns, different campaigns, depending on sort of what we're targeting. And one of the things that we've done for the last 4 or 5 years is really focus on the evidence that's used in decision making by governments. So, a part of putting forward, whether it's a piece of legislation or a regulatory change or a decision about resources, that the evidence that has been used to reason that through by government should be published too, so that we can see what that decision is based on. I mean, there's a practical and cost effectiveness thing for government there, which is, it's rather helpful when government departments can understand what the other's doing. It's rather helpful when governments can realise why, if you take an example in the UK, the Ministry of Justice prepared an amazing review, a great big review about 10 years ago of youth justice, for all the problems in youth justice. But then it ends up in an archive somewhere. Nobody ever links to it from the policy. So then 10 years later, new government comes along, starts making all the same mistakes because they don't link back to what was discovered and reviewed before. And so I think, there's good arguments from a government point of view, good government point of view. But there's very important arguments from a democracy point of view, which is that we need to see what it is that something is based on.
But post-Brexit, you have an uphill struggle, don't you? Because we're now in the age of negotiating trade deals, and many trade deals, have clauses which are non-disclosure clauses, and you have these parajudicial systems called ISDS, which says that a company can sue a government if they feel that government is threatening their policies, and that means secrecy and openness. Secrecy is the name of the game, and openness and transparency isn't there. So you've got a real problem now in getting that out into the open.
Well, you've put your finger on a really big issue there, which is non-disclosure agreements are really problematic right across the board. Not even actually just at the level of big trade deals, but in really straightforward things like government contracts. And we in the UK, we've just seen the whole thing about government contracting various agencies to go out and do work on the coronavirus testing and so on. And then you end up being unable to access the technology that they're using, unable to, to review that, unable to look at their statistics and their data. Really problematic. And there should be one simple rule here, shouldn't there? Which is that if a company contracts with government, then they should play by government's rules and not the other way around. And I think too often we see it the other way around, which is government plays by the company rules.
Okay, I mean, in all this, the scientists have a responsibility as well, because, there's some people who get really frustrated with scientists because they come on and they talk in riddles, they talk in jargon. And in order to get the evidence out there and to get people to understand it, the scientists have to develop a new narrative.
Well, I think one of the first things that scientists could do better, and I see the best ones doing, is thinking about where someone's is in the conversation, the assumptions that are in your head that are missing from other people. So often in an area of research that I don't know much about, I have to stop people and say, hold on. When they mention an institute that's doing a piece of research, I say, is that one of 10 institutes doing this kind of research? When we hear the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is finding these things around Ebola, for example, you say, okay, so is that the main one in the world that's doing that research? Are there 100 of them? Are they all going to come with different results? I need to understand what the architecture is here. I need to know the context so much more. When you produce results, so much now, especially there's so much science PR, from journals, from universities and so on, and from research councils and funders. And they put these press releases out about sort of big, discoveries and wonderful applications of science. And it's all answers to questions that none of us ever knew we had. I mean, I think we need to start quite often with that question, what is it we were seeking to solve here? When we've got yet another breakthrough in multiple sclerosis treatment, for example, why did the last stem cell breakthrough and the one before that and the one before that not work? Because we've had 10 years now, probably longer, of miracle cures coming through from stem cells that have never quite materialized into things for patients. And so I think that lack of context and sort of finding a good beginning point about where most of us are on an issue would be a really great start for scientists.
Yeah, so putting it in a context so that people understand the totality of the past, the present, and the possible future is important. What about politicians? I mean, how do we get over the fact in terms of evidence that we need politicians to think long term? I know there's an all-party parliamentary group on future generations, and in fact, our local MP chairs it. But politicians generally only look 5 years ahead. They look at whether they're going to be elected again or not. And so in order to get politicians to work on evidence is difficult when they come into conflict with the power arrangements and keeping their seats. How do we get over that in a democracy?
I mean, you're asking a really big question of leadership that I think we all need to be asking. And you're right, and in fact, 5 years sounds like a long time for me to get a politician concerned about investing in an issue, because the reality is you meet with, particularly when you meet with junior ministers in government departments, they're all thinking about where their next promotion is, going to be. You talk to someone in the Department of Transport and you know very well that they don't want to hang around here for too long. They want to get over to the Home Office or that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that that is a bit frustrating. But so, ministers knowing their brief is really important. Very good civil servants are really important as well. But I think there is, they're never going to care unless you make them realise that it's what we care about. And that's the modus operandi always that's been the sense about science. We've always mobilised big groups of people in support of the things that we do, partly because we feel that if we can't go out and convince people to work with us on something, then who can? But also, the newspapers of this world are not going to write decent science stories if they think that's not what their readership want. When they think they're going to get letters from readers as a result of doing something stupid or misrepresenting the facts, then they respond. Politicians the same. When they think voters care, They think that was one of the questions they're going to get asked in an election campaign. How did you scrutinise the evidence? Why did you misrepresent the story on this? That's the kind of thing that means they're going to invest that bit more. I mean, we run Evidence Week in Parliament. It's something that we set up about 3 years ago. And it's opened by members of the public all over the country from different walks of life, talking about why evidence matters to them. And that has included things like, we've had people there who are working on literacy in prisons. We've had community groups concerned about bees, cleaning beaches in Cornwall. Those are the people who come and open that event, and they tell MPs, evidence matters to us in our communities for these different reasons. It really changes the way that MPs then engage over the next few days in the science.
That's sort of interesting. I mean, do you think that climate change has partly helped to change this? Because what it's done is it's shown that the long term and the short term are now concertinaed up almost to an immediacy that has to make MPs and decision makers think differently in a way that they did before.
That's a really interesting question, because one of the things we're just thinking about the Evidence Week themes for the UK Parliament this year. We're doing something in Holyrood later in the year too. And one of the things we were looking at is that climate, about 10 years ago, climate was still kind of on the agenda as a long-term thing. Should governments be investing in long-term sort of remediation and monitoring and so on? Now it's on the parliamentary agenda all the time in relation to very immediate decisions and impacts. That there are things that government needs to do to protect coastal areas, for example. And actually the UK is not nearly as hard hit as some countries in the world where this is now a really pressing dominant policy concern. So you're right. What seemed like and still is a conversation about the long term is also now an immediate policy issue.
Okay, well, we sort of come to the end of the half hour, which goes very quickly. If anybody wanted to find out more about what you do or get in touch with you, where would they go?
Well, they should come to senseaboutscience.org, which is our website. But also, I think probably the fastest way to see what our output is on Twitter, where we're at senseaboutsci. And that's where you'll find first things like, if you're interested in help to cut through some of the COVID discussion, that's where we'll share new information from the kind of front line of that discussion, things that help you to sort of make sense of the news. So yeah, find us on Twitter as well. It's a very good place to look. And we are on Facebook. We are on Facebook.
Okay, well, thanks so much for doing that. And I'm sure, the COVID situation has brought a lot of these issues into the limelight, and they can obviously go to your site and look at what you're doing and the many campaigns you're on that we didn't have time to go into today because there are a lot of them. So I think it's been very interesting, and thank you for joining us. And we'll end this interview now.